Alright, in this video we are dealing with part 2 of Go Down Moses, which is also a collection of short stories. This section is called The Fire and the Hearth, which is very representative and symbolic. Alright, welcome to the CodeX Cantina. I am Una, no crypto. Today we are going to be doing a detailed step-by-step into Go Down Moses, the book, collection, short stories, whatever you want to call it. Today we are covering part 2, The Fire and the Hearth. Please consider subscribing for more Faulkner and other literature greats, and following us on Twitter if you have any questions. But this piece deserves a lot more attention, and it's potentially a great starting point for people that are new to Faulkner. What some people may not know is that Faulkner's great-grandfather may actually have been a big influence for this section and the book as a whole. It is said that in the earlier generations that these slaves, the African Americans, started out very black and over generations became lighter skinned. This is a concept known as shadow families to some, with the idea that with a slave owner, sometimes he took liberties with his slaves. The idea is that these people having children that they had to take care of that they did not consent to. So let's dive into what the impacts of that is on these families. And today our hero is Lucas Beauchamp, who is one of my favorite creations by William Faulkner. Some people may not view it that way, but let's talk about how I have interpreted his actions and what they mean to him and his struggle to understanding his lineage, what his role is in his family, and how the community of whites have reacted to what they have done to this gentleman and his family. So starting out, Lucas Beauchamp is 67 and is the son of Turl and Tenny, the two slaves that we explored in the previous section. Again, please go watch that video on that if you haven't had a chance to read that. You need to. This is such a great work. So he is African American, descendant from slaves, but he's got some McCaslin white blood in him, as we know from Turl from section 1. So he does have some white lineage. Please check out our Before You Read Go Down Moses if you didn't know, but the general idea is that the white community viewed you as if you had any part of you that was not white, you were not part of the community. So even if you were 25% white or 75% white, that other part that was not white excluded you from other white privileges in the Jim Crow era in southern United States. So we're starting out with Lucas Beauchamp hiding his whiskey still. This is closer to World War II timeline as opposed to the previous section, which was when slavery was legalized. And we're wondering, okay, why is he hiding the still? We quickly find out that his daughter's kind of suitor, George, is also starting to use the still and produce illegal alcohol. So he views them as a competition sort of thing. If George were to start doing something stupid and attract the law, then the law would potentially be investigating Lucas's illegal moonshine business here. So the most important part here is we start to realize that Lucas is a self-made man, if you will. He has a drive. He has an ambition. He is struggling to provide wealth and make a name for himself almost in an illegal way. At this point in time, we assume Lucas is poor and that he's doing this because he needs to. We can also assume that because I think we believe he is a tenant farmer, which wasn't the poorest, but you didn't own property, you owned the machinery and basically kind of cash rented the land. And okay, that was really short, but again, go check out the Before Go Down Moses, where I'll actually describe it with crypto, my historian, a little bit more accurately than that. So at this point in time, we frequently learn that Lucas is ignored by the Carruthers and McCaslin line, which goes back to the idea of the white community not acknowledging them, as even though he does have the heritage blood is in them is shared as a McCaslin bloodline. Thus, he ought to be owed some of the patrimony too, but it doesn't seem like he's captured on it right now as he's struggling with this farming and illegal still business. Why? So he's heading out to the mound where he's got his still buried and stumbles upon a coin that must have been buried there by Buck and Buddy, his ancestors. And that's when he sees and hears the footsteps of his daughter spying and realizes she must be reporting on George. So George got to go. So I like what Faulkner has set up here. We have a man that through his patrimony ought to be given some of the wealth of his past. Yet he's being denied it through Reconstruction and Jim Crow racism. We see him undermining the law and the white class at this point to kind of become a self-made man to the point where he's trying to do it on his own, which I think is very admirable and a typical heroic characteristic for an underdog. He kind of reminds me a lot of Ned McCaslin from the Reavers, the kind of distant cousins and the way Ned sneaks into the car and kind of orchestrates things. That's kind of how I view Lucas, and I think it's very endearing as we explore it through this section, kind of what Faulkner has Lucas do. So the next section, I'm sure, is what will confuse and probably put off some readers. Let's explore this together, guys. So Lucas is leaving in the middle of the night. We see him taking time away from his family to kind of pursue the still, the wealth, that sort of thing. So he heads up to Edmund's house. And here's where we're going to get launched into this really long, convoluted backstory. Why isn't it clear? Well, Faulkner's doing this on purpose. Remembering what you did 5 minutes ago, and let alone 50 years ago, is kind of hard to remember. So what he does is he plays with this as he's writing, as certain details are omitted. The way he describes the eyes on the pillow opened, he doesn't describe that he's looking at a man sitting down on a pillow. You get these loose contextual clues that you as a reader have to piece together. And again, I think that's drawing on the idea of that memory kind of fades and you drop certain details in the same way that I think that where he's kind of exploring that with Lineage, where are these people being mistreated? Are we forgetting the convenient things in the same way that in the previous section with Safanza celebrating Warwick and the Earl, she's self-aggrandizing the southern beauty parts, but forgetting the dirty creak and floorboards that need repairing in the backyard. That's why I think he's doing that here. So Lucas arrives at the front door, notices the machinery, notices all the modern technology, kind of looks down upon it, and then enters into this flashback. But he recalls 20 years ago when massive rains were coming down and Roth was being born. Roth's mother was having complications during the pregnancy, and Lucas left kind of risking his life in this torrential downpour to go get a doctor to help save her. At the same time, Molly and Lucas just had their boy at the same time, and Molly is there helping to deliver, helping to help Roth and his father, Zach, in any way that she can. Now, the mother doesn't make it through the pregnancy. She passes away. So you kind of have Zach and Roth. What happens is Molly kind of becomes the surrogate mother. She stays at the same time nursing both boys. And this might seem very strange. It is by modern eyes, but particularly going back even before this era when slavery was still legal, plantation life was viewed as kind of more, everyone on the family worked together, not cohesively, not willingly, but they worked together to raise everyone in the family, including the slaves and the white children at the same time. The slaves at that time, the African Americans, were responsible in helping to raise those children. You start to see a little bit of that mentality still ooze through this, even though slavery is no longer legal. I think you're starting to see Molly still have some of those traditions of the past where she's helping to raise Roth at this point in time. How does that land upon Lucas, the self-made man who's proud and doesn't think he needs others to move up in the world? They talk here about the fire still burning in the hearth. It started the day of their marriage. This fire represents the love between the two of them and how he's forging the fire to make sure that it still continues. It's very symbolic of their love. And here she is kind of living in this other house. And if we're going to bring in what happened to slaves in the past without consent, I think Lucas might be worried what's happening with Molly. Why is she staying at Zach's house raising this Rothschild? This is probably an influence from Faulkner's real life as well. He did have a mammy, Caroline Barr, who I think this book is dedicated to, if not even at least the section. And she helped raise the family in the same way that Molly is providing for these families in this story. I think maybe that's why this part really resonates with me as a reader, because I think it is so true to what Faulkner saw with his, the lightning of the generations with his great-grandfather, with Molly kind of helping to raise. I think this is very personal for Faulkner. So Lucas heads over, demands that his wife returns. His wife comes back with both kids. He realizes she's kind of raising them both, and he's had enough. Lucas decides out of pride to kill Zach, and I think this is one of the more emotional climax moments of at least the second section of the story, where you have him holding the blade, very representative of the slavery weapons at the time, and you have Zach, who has the gun, which he thought was hidden under the pillow. Again, very representative of the white plantation owner to have the gun in this face-off. And the gun, typically in literature, represents manhood. They both put their weapons of choice aside. They're putting their manhoods aside, as Lucas owns and is deserved of his own life and his own patrimony and is denied a lot of things. And Zach, I don't think he means to keep them down, but you'll notice he's leveraging and using this to help his life move forward. I think what you're seeing is Lucas holds Zach accountable, and I'm not sure if Zach totally views it the same way, but you have this standoff where they're like, okay, we're putting our manhood aside because the manhood of the gun and the knife isn't, or the razor is not equal. They face themselves as equals in this scene. And during the struggle, they're even giving each other the chance to go get the gun. Well, the struggle is fantastic. It's very, very thrilling and a very good representation of Faulkner writing, actually good action. He typically is not very detailed, but this was quite good. And at the end, you have the gun shooting blanks when Lucas finally gets it and kind of shoves it into Zach's side. Again, very autobiographical. This actually did happen in Faulkner's life. His grandfather was once in a duel and the opponent's gun misfired in the duel. But we have some wonderful quotes here as they explore Lineage. Maybe that's why you done it. Because what you and your pa got from old Carruthers had to come to you through a woman, a critter, not responsible like men are responsible, not to be held like men are held. Again, this is an older text, don't forget that. But Zach received this property through a mother, of Carruthers' line, which in this time, this era, patrimony went through the father's line typically, and technically Lucas would be responsible for receiving some of this patrimony. You see him struggling with this idea of what is he owed versus what has he created. But I think this also comes to a reckoning between Zach, where you realize that Lucas, while African American, while in the separate segregation laws but not equal of Jim Crow era, is viewed as different from perhaps others. He is still family, and Zach does not mistreat him specifically, but he doesn't necessarily grant him the rights or think about him. It's almost like an afterthought where he doesn't really realize what he's doing to Lucas Beauchamp and his family. At the same time, I think some critics will point out that perhaps Lucas is glad that he didn't actually have the gun fire off or kill him. Due to the lynch law at the time, he most likely would have hung for his crimes. This will be explored later in some other works in this book. But we have a very powerful line here when Lucas holds the bullet in his hand. He says, "It was large enough to contain 2 lives." And that's going back to the idea that if he had killed him, he perhaps would have been hung. He starts to talk here about the idea of how can a black man ask a white man not to sleep with his wife. This goes back to the theme of during slavery, if you couldn't say no. There was no consent in the relationship between a slave owner and the slave themselves. How can you stand up for what you believe, what you want as a family man when the law and everyone behind is not on your side and everything is not due to be equal? It's an interesting and important question here that I think he's using a monologue, kind of like you would typically see in Shakespearean works, to drive out what should my reader be thinking about at this point in time, because you can go a lot of different ways. "How to God," he said, "can a black man ask a white man to please not lay down with his black wife? And even if he could ask it, how to God can the white man promise he won't?" So we have the usage here also of God and bringing in the Bible of coveting thy neighbor's property, covering thy neighbor's wife. Very interesting the way to see that Faulkner kind of explores a very complex, layered issue. All right, so after that really long backstory, let's jump back in time. Now Lucas is asking kind of the boy that he helped save, his wife raise, Roth. He's knocking on Roth's door. So this should give you some more context as to Roth is going to view them also kind of maybe I think in the way that Zach did. But he tells them about George's still with the idea that, okay, I want him to call the police because I can't call the police because I have African American blood in my heritage. Therefore, the cops won't respond or respect my wishes, which is true of this era. So Lucas heads back and he kind of forgot to tell him that he was going to quit, goes to sleep. Finally, the man never sleeps, right? He's a self-made man pursuing things that I think he's struggling with in terms of what he's owned versus what he's built. But the next day he wakes up and finds George's still and moonshine on his porch, waiting for the cops to arrive and make him look guilty. What a turn of events. So the cops show up. There's some arguing back and forth. They can't really argue who stills is whose, so they arrest them both. And what this kind of explores is they have the idea that your family can't testify against you, right? So Natalie can't testify against Lucas. Natalie wants to marry George. So if Lucas concedes and allows Natalie to marry George, then George would not be able to testify against Lucas. So the only way Lucas can get out of this is if he allows his daughter to marry George to thus negate the legal action that could be claimed against him. They don't write stories like this anymore. So we head back and we start to see Natalie ask for things, for money for the to fix up their porch, I think it was, amongst some other things. And what we find is that she actually was already married to George. So this whole stunt caboodle was to kind of get A, consent, but also B, more property and things extorted out of Lucas, the father, than he even needed to if he had known the whole piece of the truth. What a complex and interesting little turn of events for Natalie to have played on Lucas here. So fast forward, and George is not using the money to fix up the things that they had talked about. He's actually fixing up the still and following kind of in the footsteps of Lucas, and we see him kind of vying to want to be a tenant farmer and own property in the same way that Lucas had. So part 2 of The Fire in the Hearth, again, what a wonderful adventure. We're going to go down the idea of money is the root of all evil, the 1 Timothy section of the Bible, where the idea is that the money itself is not evil. It's the root of it because it spawns greed. Lucas has a great amount of greed in this section, right? So remember how he found that coin in part 1? Well, finally, we're getting back to it. He's trying to get a salesman to lend him, have Roth lend him money that he could rent this metal detection machine, the money diviner, to find money, to increase one's wealth through entrepreneurial needs of finding it, I guess. You can view it in this section. First section, it was the still. This section, it's finding the money with this. So basically, he's denied the right by Roth, again, white man, holding moving money and property away from the African American community. And you see him kind of manipulate the salesman with a bill of sale for a mule that is technically owned by Roth, but viewed by Lucas, not explicitly said, as his, because of the patrimony that he believes that is owed to him from his father's line that we've been exploring these last few chapters. So when Roth finds out, he takes Dan and Oscar and goes hunting for them, confronts them out in the middle of the night as they're digging on the land. Big hup to do, again, kind of exploring the same theme here. There's a small racial commentary here where Dan and Oscar recognize Lucas's footprints, but being of African American heritage, they do not tell on Lucas. So Lucas, they go home to wash up and they say that they just need one more day, and Lucas kind of manipulates them and keeps kind of saying, well, we're going to find this. Would you like a piece of this? Kind of pushing him along. And we see some misreading of paper here where he may be hiding George, his son-in-law, to hide some gold to kind of influence the salesman to want to keep looking for the rest of the gold. So they end up in the orchard where it's divided. Again, I think a small little symbol of the divided classes and divided racial equalities of the time. So here's where they find that silver stash of coins, and the salesman starts to try to pull the upper arm of let's find the other part. And you see Lucas say, well, you got the machine, you find it. What he's doing is he's getting the salesman interested in searching. The root of all evil is greed, the greed for gold. Here he's getting the white man, the salesman, to greed for it. He's doing an investment of planting this money, seeding the apple orchard, if you will, with the idea that he's going to now have the salesman rent the machine back from him until he makes a profit off of it. Again, I think this subverts expectations with how Lucas makes the money, and I think that's what makes this section so funny, especially from a dark humor perspective. Part 3, we have the years later take. This is taken from notes, not necessarily from previously published short stories. So this is kind of some ideas that Faulkner was exploring with Molly is now searching for a divorce. Why? 1 Timothy, the root of all evil. Lucas has lost his mind. He's obsessed with looking for this gold instead of doing what a man ought to do, which is to take care of his family. We have a quote from her, because God say, what's rendered to my earth, it belonged to me until I resurrect it, and let him or her touch it, and beware. So here you have them kind of exploring this idea of, can Lucas give this up for the greater good of the family? And here's also where we get a little bit more of that backstory, where when Molly leaves, we have Edmund's mind kind of recalling how he was related to them, how he was raised by Molly. This is his pseudo mother, with Lucas being his pseudo father. I know Zach's his dad, but we start to see how Lucas had other siblings that kind of took off in terms of the brother and the sister that kind of took off. We have that Isaac McCaslin kind of repudiated his heritage, which is how it ended up on the women's side, the Edmonds Carruthers side of the family. But we got a quick throwback to kind of the poker game in section 1, as well as this is the section where Roth starts to realize that he needs to do more for these people, particularly as he viewed this woman as his mother to help raise him, correct? He thinks about Henry and Nat and how he grew up with them, shared beds with them, shared meals with them, and the one day when he slept on the pallet. And that's when you had a divide, a class, a racial divide between what his past owed him, I think, is what Faulkner is going for here, because you have Lucas being denied what the past owed him, and you have what brought Zach and what brought Roth forth good fortune with their past and how it impacted their lives much differently than what Lucas's family is going through. This is symbolic of what the white community as a whole, via one family, the white privilege, I think is what most people would call it today. Here we start to see him kind of reminisce how Lucas always referred to his father Zach as Mr. Edmonds instead of Zach or anything of that sort. And I think you start to realize he's starting to realize there's something going on behind the scenes, aka remember the knife and gunfight up earlier, that there's a difference in respect that Lucas is willfully choosing to show these people. And I think he's just now starting to come to face the realities of what he's almost maybe mentally segregated or decided not to acknowledge for a long time. So Roth heads to Lucas's house and is like, hey man, we need to talk. The fire's still burning. They're not completely divorced yet, right? The love isn't gone. The fire is still burning, which is representative since day one of their marriage that Lucas has helped to kindle. And now you have Roth coming to talk to him. He starts to talk about the land, how much they need to farm, how Lucas is chasing, each night, what stress that's bringing to the family of him not sleeping and Molly, and how it's not just about him. He needs to be looking out for the bigger picture of things. I'm not the biggest fan. Some people I think might call this white-splaining, but I'm not a fan of how Faulkner approached this section. But We needed some type of a trigger for Lucas to turn his life around. I'm not the biggest fan of Roth being that piece, but I do like that Roth finally needed to face up to his past of what he's kind of been manipulating or using. When they go to court, Lucas finally raises his hand and realizes that he needs to give up this life, says that he will not go forward with the divorce, and agrees to get rid of kind of the money machine, the metal detector. Lucas gives Edmonds the machine and says he never wants to see it again. We're given 70 years on this earth. And him being at the age of 67, he doubts he'll ever see that money. And now we start to get that little bit of information about the bank. Lucas spent his whole life in the shadow of his heritage. And this was a large chunk of money that he has in the bank that he's not leveraging. He's not accepting that. He's begrudgingly kind of living and trying to make his self-made man, his way in life, against a class structure that is not equal, a class structure set up to keep him down, and that he thinks that he wants to kind of tackle, I think is what Faulkner was going for here. And it resulted in him kind of ruining his marriage at 67 years old, him working hard every day to this point in his life with $3,000 in the bank all along. So I think we as the reader see he didn't need the money. This was all him struggling with heritage. What is due to him? What does he earn? What belongs to him in life? Lucas is a creation of the past, and we get these nice little vignettes of what he is struggling with, and I think we start to see he made some mistakes along the way too in terms of greed and his drive for things. I don't think Faulkner has a very clear picture here of characters are good or bad, and I think that a lot of people may struggle with that. But I think Lucas Beauchamp is one of those interesting characters that subverts expectations. He's created some very funny scenes here, and I think he actually is kind of that hero where he's trying to do his best, though he may be misguided in his journey along the way. I think we do see some condemnation of maybe some of the past that the white community has created, and we're going to explore that even more with the rest of this book as we keep going through this step by step. This was just section 2. Again, I promise our goal is to combine sections 3 and 4 and 6 and 7. We've done the bear in a 2-part. Very, very, very detailed. But I think this story is worth a deeper dive. I think it's worth discussion. What did you guys think about Lucas in this text? How did it land upon you? Did today's discussions help you, or did it not align with what you were maybe taking away from this text? I'd love to hear from you guys down below. Please consider subscribing for more Faulkner discussions and the future releases of our discussions of Go Down Moses. Una out.